Welcome to Arash's World. Today we have a very special guest and an absolutely stunning topic that's very close to my heart. Welcome to Arash's World, Rabbi Matthew Ponak.
Thank you for having me here, Ash.
Great. So before we get started talking about your book, I'd like you to briefly introduce yourself in any way you see fit. And that is the toughest questions to start up with, and then the next ones will be easier as we go along.
Sure. Well, I am a rabbi, which means I'm ordained as a leader of the Jewish religion. And what I specialize in is a translation of Jewish wisdom for people of any background. And specifically with my book that just came out, Embodied Kabbalah, it's about Jewish spiritual and mystical wisdom that has to do especially with living a balance between our regular lives, if you will, and our spiritual lives, and finding that harmony in our world.
That's wonderful. So your book is Embodied Kabbalah, Jewish Mysticism for All People, and you mentioned that, and I love it that you're making this wisdom accessible to everyone, and that is something where we often don't feel. It feels like there are only certain people who have access to it, but by translating it, by commenting on it, by choosing these specific stories and these texts and explaining it in your book, you make it accessible to us all.
Absolutely. That's the whole point. And I think there are reasons why people keep some spiritual teachings and practices secret, so to speak. And often it's because they're very powerful, or because if they got into the wrong hands, they could be used for manipulation. Also, they can harm people if people aren't careful and wise in how they're using them. And so one of the reasons I felt good and okay, quite frankly, with sharing this so widely is because the book isn't about transcending the earthly plane. It's really about finding that sweet spot between deep spiritual engagement and regular, ordinary responsibilities and fun and work-life balance, if you will.
I love that. And so it's really, and the embodied part shows that, because the Kabbalah would think of something like very mysterious, something that's far away, that's probably not accessible to very few people. And what you're doing is you're bringing it down to earth, which I find fascinating. And just to give you a bit of background about myself, as when I was studying Buddhism, for me, I felt like I wanted to become a monk. I wanted to move to a monastery and reach enlightenment and so on. But then I thought again, I was like, well, if you want to reach enlightenment, why not do so living your ordinary life and do it here instead of in a remote, secluded place? And so that really spoke to me of bringing the holy into our ordinary life, which is something that you're looking at.
Precisely. And I understand the monastic urge. I've had it as well. I've done a lot of exploring before I became a rabbi. And also, now that I am a rabbi, it's not like I've stopped exploring either. I've learned from many different traditions and disciplines, and I include those in my teaching. And that's part of the reason why I want to open this up to everyone, because I feel really a member of this global spiritual landscape. But one of the things I find so special, and I hesitate to say unique because there's so many different traditions and lineages out there, but it's rare, certainly, to find a tradition that it's for householders. It's for people, not necessarily who own homes, right? That's harder and harder these days, but for people who have dependents they're caring for, are working, or have responsibilities outside of a monastery, let's say, because Judaism hasn't had monks pretty much ever in our history. And so our spiritual development and our spiritual paths and methods are really in the context of people living in this world and engaging with society.
That is very interesting, because I actually hadn't thought of that. You know, that the monastic life and so on, it does apply to various major world religions. But the idea is, I think, to stop the distractions, to really focus on the spiritual aspect. But this comes at the expense of the body and the life we have. And so what I see with with Catholic traditions, Christian traditions, is that kind of basic hatred of the body, or that kind of like this spirit is the main thing, the soul, and you want to purify the body, and it's like kind of like seen as some sort of punishment that we have to deal with this life to get to the next one. And I disagree with that.
Well, the term spirituality back in the day was the opposite of corporeality. which meant physicality, that those two things were seen as separate. So the idea of a body-based spirituality is kind of a paradox, which I think is really interesting. And I don't want to misportray the history of Judaism. We have had our share of ascetics, of people who wanted to move beyond the body and those kinds of things. But one of the wonderful things about studying a religion in depth, which I got to do in my studies to become a rabbi, is you get to see all the nuances there. And in every generation, I think it's incumbent upon religious leaders to bring forth the teachings that are most relevant and most helpful. And so I have selected embodiment texts, body-based, grounded texts from the last 1,000 years, essentially, of Jewish mysticism in order to portray that particular much needed method and lesson about that balance. Right? There are certainly schools of Jewish mysticism also, not to also go the opposite direction, that are very much body-centered and where it really emphasized that. For example, the Hasidic movement in its beginnings in Eastern Europe in the 1700s was saying that God is everywhere, including in our bodies, and we don't need to move beyond this world to find God. And that was relatively rare and special for that time to say it so boldly. But you'll find a mix, and the important thing really in this project is to highlight and emphasize the elements which I think are most helpful for people wanting to find that balanced way.
And when we find mysticism, it's like when you read a mystic text, it has like it's the same thing often. It's like all these roads that are, and people take different paths, and that's why again I like it that you say it for all people. And you might get to the same location, but using a different path, and it's not unique to that one tradition. But once you get there, I find it's like a common language. So some of the things you describe in your book, I can perfectly relate to. But mine was more the experience of first like of Zen, where they say like mountains are mountains, and then mountains are not mountains, and then you go back to them being mountains. And it's different when you read about them and you understand it intellectually, but when you experience that, it's life-changing.
And in fact, that exact teaching is found on one of the pages of my book, because I have comparative sections. And there's a teaching from Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who was late 1700s, early 1800s, really profound mystic. He died at a very young age, but he wrote these incredible writings that are like getting more popular basically every year, it seems. And one of the things he says is there's these stages in the spiritual development that, what might start off as sort of ordinary reality, we get into these magical realms after that. But after those magical realms, things are taking this other shift. And the way he describes it, it's sort of beyond all of those mystical levels. There's something profound, which some people describe as equanimity or nothingness or emptiness, or just the ordinariness of all existence in this profound way. And so I included that teaching that you just cited from Zen on that page, because it has resonance. And I'm not someone who wants to pigeonhole traditions and say this is this and this is that. But there are ways in which mystical strivers and seekers will find teachings aligning with them as they're exposing themselves to different cultures and traditions.
What you also mentioned, though, which I found fascinating, I hadn't thought about that myself, is that kind of gradually getting there and getting used to the light. And so, if you look at Zen again, it's like Satori or enlightenment, that it hits you and suddenly you get everything. And that's actually not always the best way. It probably is not the best way. What you want is kind of integrating those experiences, incorporating, and specifically the word incorporate, with your body, so that it becomes part of your being. And I think of Plato's cave too. It's like he suddenly walks out in this bright light and he sees everything and he's excited. But that didn't go so well, and others could not respond to that, because we need a kind of a movement in that direction, like stepping stones as well.
It sounds like, it sounds like you're referring to the text by Midrash Rabbeinu Bachya, where he says just that it's maybe not so wise or possible or healthy to just go from zero to infinity all at once, that we can have an experience that actually might be in a small way kind of fracturing or challenging. And that's okay. It's like working out our muscles. After we put the weights down and we feel some pain, and then our muscles are actually growing and healing so we can lift more next time. But if we pick up the heaviest barbell on day one, we might injure ourselves. And that's, he ends that teaching by saying the way that the body works is the way that the soul works. They
Mhm.
follow the same set of rules. We have to take time to integrate. And I think that really relates, Arash, to the sense of the householder responsibilities, because it's possible to injure ourselves, to injure our minds if we go too fast. And it's
Yeah.
someone, I know the story from the intro of The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, where he says he spent about 2 years on a park bench just in bliss before as he was kind of integrating that initial experience. And maybe that could work for someone who didn't have dependence. But if someone is, again, participating in a way that they have a job, they need to show up on time, they need to pay their taxes, they need to care for their children or their animals or something, or show up for their spouse, 2 years on a park bench is going to be a really tough sell in that
Mhm.
situation. So
Mhm.
part of the integrated method is actually keeping that in mind, is that we can't blow our brains out to be kind of extreme about it. We have to find that way forward where we can stay here, while also following those paths of transformation.
But this is a challenge for many people, and especially if we're looking at our current generation where we want quick results. And so I think technology has made that worse because, and I just had a class where I talked about how technology has changed, where the internet, when you go on the website, it would take 20 minutes for the page to load. And we were fine with that. Or you had to make a choice between, do I choose the phone or do I choose the internet? Because you couldn't have both at the same time. But nowadays, it's gotten even worse. So I'm worried about people who would go for drugs and say this is the quick path, but without, and you get a glimpse of things, and maybe you can share your thoughts on it, and which is pretty mind-boggling and mind-opening. But that's not it, because you do have to do the heavy lifting to get there. It's just like a glimpse. Yeah.
I think it is possible for people engaging with psychedelics in a guided space, in a well-held place, not just to have experience of, let's say, transcendence, but also take time to integrate them. And it probably will often bring stuff up that was hidden. And that's a great opportunity to look at what's going on inside of us. And I think, again, in the right context, that can be incredibly powerful. Just like if people have a tendency towards mystical moments without psychedelics, the same thing can happen if they view it as an opportunity to just experience the cosmos for its own sake. There is something really beautiful about that. And I don't want to denigrate it, but at the same time, if they're not taking time to integrate and reflect and see what's arisen from that, they could actually miss some of the content that's surfaced. And so some of the work that follows that is important as well. What comes to mind, though, is this sort of instant enlightenment, or our desire to have, oh, I'm going to
Yeah.
type in enlightenment to chat GPT and it'll be done. That kind of thing. The one, not the one, but the beautiful component in Jewish mysticism is that we have Shabbat. We have this day of rest and refreshment. This, to quote a colleague and really a wonderful author of mine, is Marilyn Paul. She wrote a book called An Oasis in Time, and it's a guide to a personalized Sabbath practice. And her and other teachers right now are talking about, it doesn't have to be one day a week. It could be in the evening. It could be a moment here or there. But the idea of tapping into this feeling like everything is good, everything is complete, we can punctuate our lives with moments like that. And that, in its best sense, is that kind of instant enlightenment moment. That if someone is practicing that Shabbat mindset, the via positiva, you could call it, and to quote Eckhart, Meister Eckhart, Christian mystic, this sense of cultivating the good and arriving. And yeah, we're going to come out of that and we're going to go back to the spiritual work or the actual physical work we're doing in the world. But we can have both. I don't think it has to be either or. And I think if everyone has this need or this impulse towards completion and finality, and built into the landscape of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, is there's moments for that. There's moments where all we're doing is cultivating through these various ways, physically, spiritually, getting together with people, singing songs of joy. That is part of that, satisfying that urge to feel like we've made it. And that can flow into the rest of our week and the rest of our lives.
I love that. But what we're seeing today is also mindfulness, and people are yoga, and people are choosing those paths, which is a great thing. I think it does awaken several parts of our connection with also spirituality and the divine in our lives. But what I'm worried about is that some people use it as an escape, right? So as something like, I get away and I have my break, like going on vacation, and that's it. and others are looking at it, but in a very like limited way. So they take away that spiritual aspect and kind of a disembodied way of like, okay, this is good for the brain. And to me, that's like, I don't know, like using like cannabis without THC. In the sense, it's like, you know, you're missing out an important vital aspect of it. And what I like in psychology, the transpersonal psychology, where we are looking at the psyche, and people like Otto Rank talk about the psyche, the soul, and so on. It's coming into the discussion, but it's still like people are hesitant, and the experts and professional psychologists are hesitant to embrace that in many cases too.
There's a lot of benefit that has been gained from extracting mindfulness from its Buddhist monastic origins and distilling it for people pretty much anywhere to make use of without feeling religious, quote unquote, or anything like that. And that's a wonderful thing. And I've talked to Buddhist teachers recently who have said, yeah, and wouldn't it be nice if compassion was emphasized more, the way that we treat each other from those mindful moments. And similarly, I think what you're saying, it can feel like a vacation. And as I was just saying with Shabbat, it's great to have vacation time. But if all we're doing in our spiritual lives is cultivating this sense of transcendence or bliss or even calm and moving beyond, we're actually missing an essential ingredient, which is the deep inner work. That's what I would call spiritual work as opposed to spiritual rest. And spiritual work involves actually confronting things and understanding that if I'm feeling off, it's not a matter of soothing myself. It's actually, maybe there's something misaligned that's arisen in me. Maybe it's from childhood, or maybe it's from that horrible conversation I had yesterday, or that, some combination. And when we can do that spiritual work, it's called work because it's hard and we have to face parts of ourselves. But it's the difference between giving somebody a compliment to make the dynamic feel better, which can be great, and being honest with someone about something that you've done to wrong them or they've done to wrong you, and in hopes of actually repairing the relationship at a deeper level. That's the difference right there. And they're both needed. The last thing I'll say on this topic is sometimes we're so triggered in our work lives or in our non-bliss modes, let's say, that we actually need some mindfulness type practice to settle ourselves down so we can then go deeper. And I think they can complement each other. But I agree with what I think you were sharing, which is sometimes mindfulness in the most, let's say, focus on your breath, calm yourself down. If that's all the practice is, it's a wonderful introduction to the potentials, but I think something else is needed to deepen that and to move people to what's next.
Yeah, and also the concept of spirituality for me, it's like, and I like the mystics because they use the example of wine, for example, the ones I've read, and like wine as in like the actual drinking of wine, which is fine, but also as something like beyond that, or even sexual intimacy, and we have that, and it's not like in various traditions where it's really frowned upon and it's like a sin and all that. And I like the mystics because they are like really open to those pleasures of life, as well as again doing the work, as you're saying. And for me, it was a psychoanalysis that really like said, you need to look at these things, you need to get rid of these obstacles, and then what happens is it clears the way for the divine and the spiritual to enter when you get rid of those blockages that we all carry within ourselves.
Yeah, it's like what that famous quote from Rumi, something along the lines of, it's not about sort of bringing more love in, it's about clearing the blockages between
Yeah,
us and love.
yeah,
Yeah, there's a metaphor that's spoken of by a very early Kabbalist, Abraham Abulafia, and he says something along the lines of, it's about untying the knots of the soul.
mm,
And I've understood through a friend of mine who's a historian of science that the word soul and the word mind hundreds of years ago was really often used interchangeably. It was our inner worlds. And so not everyone likes the word soul. That's fine. We could say mind, we can say inner world. I think it's just about the layers of the self inside of us, really. And yeah, it is about understanding what's gotten clogged up or what's gotten in the way. And as we come to those places where we really, the inner world, it's about understanding what's gone wrong. It's not about shifting or changing intentionally. Once we get a glimpse of the truth of an element of ourselves, it tends to shift and change and adapt on its own.
And we were often driven by fear, though, and by worry, and so we're kind of often on autopilot. And I find myself I was like that too, where you miss out on so much beauty that is around us. So I take a walk and I'm just obsessing with my work or what's going to happen. I'm worrying about tomorrow or I'm worrying about the past. And once you let that go in many ways, then you can see the beauty that surrounds us, and you can notice the ducks and you can hear the birds singing. But when we're not, we miss out on all of those things. And one thing that I've also found is like synchronicity, events that don't make a lot of sense, but are pushing me in a certain direction, or guiding me, not pushing, guiding me in the right direction in my life. And that has made a tremendous impact on my life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a lot of content that's flying at us in our
Mhm.
world, and most people, or a lot of people listening to podcasts at least, they tend to live in cities more often, and it's harder to get in touch with just the wilderness or the beauty of it all. And one of the keys to a lot of this, and this is, I mean, it's mentioned on at least one of the pages in my book, but it's quite universal. You'll find it in a lot of places, that we should be aware of what we're taking in, not just what we're eating, but what we're hearing and what we're seeing, that these things have an impact. And I think a lot about phones and how ubiquitous they are right now. They're everywhere. And the news really should be called the bad news, because that's what it is. It's what's wrong with the world. And I'm really happy to live in a country and a society more broadly that has freedom of the press. That's extremely important. And I try to limit myself, because the news exposure, those kinds of things, it can get me down. Social media notifications. So part of a practice for refreshment in this Shabbat sense, but also just for living well, more broadly speaking, is about putting the phone away and turning it off,
Mhm.
and going for a walk and allowing that to fall away, as we can engage with something more inherently beautiful and positive, because there's a lot to be thankful for, really,
Yes.
in our world right now.
Yes, yes, and it doesn't seem like that when we just follow the news or we look what's happening around us. But there is so much good too, and so about living well, I like it how there is this movement in psychology to really improve. Like Maslow, really, I think got the ball rolling in many ways of like self-actualization. To me, that is really close to connecting with something beyond us, like and so that kind of growth, that it's personal but also spiritual growth, and that looking at that, or even the peak and flow experiences. To me, that's just like it. That's exactly it. When you're in a peak, you're in a mystic state, in a mystical state as well.
Yeah, and just the fact that, so Maslow, right, correlated peak experiences with the stage of self-actualization. And the fact that there's so many people in our society that have the potential for
Yeah.
self-actualization is something remarkable, and to appreciate, to be thankful for. We, in those ways, are living the dreams of so many of our ancestors who didn't have basic safety and security and food. And even if not everyone has access to all the medicine they'd like right now, I don't want to belittle anyone's experience if they don't agree with this, but we have so much that our ancestors had been striving for. And the news and social media algorithms are tremendously good at getting us to forget that and think like we don't have enough. But the self-actualization, yeah, that you could basically define that in the Kabbalistic language. Peak experience is what the Hasidim call devekut, which means connecting or cleaving with the infinite. And it's those moments that, if we can prime ourselves, right? You can never, you can lead the soul to the divine, but you can't make them cleave. You know, we can't make it happen, so to speak, but we can increase the likelihood that we're going to have these magical moments. And
And
that's through getting our bases taken care of, and then engaging with the beautiful and the wonderful in the very most simple way.
yeah, and it is around us. It is already around us. And so we are often looking for something that we think is far away, is outside, but it's already here. So I like also how you talk about the wholly embedded in the ordinary, and of like, because we're driven, I used to be driven by the sky's the limit and you can go past it. But yes, but we also want to be firmly grounded in reality and in the present and in our daily life. So that kind of like combination of both, not it's not one or the other, it's you want both in your life. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading a book about the life of the Buddha. It wasn't written by a Buddhist, and I remember it was at the Buddhist school I went to, and the professor saying, "Well, this isn't written by a Buddhist. What do you think that means? How does that impact the writing?" But the teaching that I remember was that the Buddha explored these different levels of meditation, these different states of mind, and found that the more profound ones actually weren't the most helpful for realization, and so ended up somewhere in the middle of the spectrum.
Interesting.
And when I think about true joy and true bliss in life, it's actually being with loved ones, friends and family, eating good food, hanging out, just having a wonderful, like a barbecue. To me, that is enlightenment. That is a taste of heaven on earth. And I am thankful that I've had encounters with profound bliss states on my journey, but really where I ended up landing, at least in this point, is just appreciating the fine, subtle, wonderful, everyday joys. And to me, that is the most refreshing, gratitude-filled, wonderful experience that I can have.
Yeah, so I remember again about Zen because that was the tradition I was very interested in, and I see its limits as well. Not just saying here that I am a Zen Buddhist, I'm not, but
Sure, well, they all have
I thought,
limits, right? I could
yeah,
talk about limits of Kabbalah if you want,
there you go.
but
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
But what I liked a lot was this one quote about I think a person who would reach enlightenment and said like it's you basically do your daily life like you would say doing the dishes and meeting your friends and so on, but slightly higher, a few inches above the ground. And that's I think for me really encapsulates what I think is important. It's like yes, go back to your daily life, but see it like you've been outside of Plato's cave, you've come back, and now your whole world has changed even though how I act, what I say is exactly the same, or who I hang out with is the same, but I have profoundly changed because of those experiences.
Yeah, and I haven't studied that much Zen exactly. You know what I mean? I've studied Buddhist philosophy. I've been more exposed to Tibetan Buddhism, but it's hard to not be exposed to Zen if you're a spiritual seeker today. One of the ways, there's almost a question that I have. So there are forms, you could say, of Jewish enlightenment. There's several texts in the book that talk about different types of realization, but the general thrust in the tradition is that as long as we're here, we've got work to do. There's no perfection. There's no ultimate end. And so I think about that cave metaphor, that someone can glimpse the light outside the cave and come back, but they're still working on stuff, right? It's maybe they're working, the way they work on stuff is different than they used to in some way, but I don't know if that's truly a difference between Zen and Kabbalah as I'm articulating it, but just to say, a household or tradition, you're gonna notice when, no matter how profoundly realized someone is, yeah, they're human and they're gonna mess up sometimes. They're gonna have bad days. That's part of being in the muck of ordinary reality. So I wonder if a monastic tradition, if those kinds of attitudes of a permanent state, let's say, would exist if they were truly among the people all day, every day. And I don't have the answer. I don't know that many enlightened Zen monks or people who would ever claim that they were. But just to say, there's something important for me as a teacher of Jewish wisdom to say that people are people, and we're never done the work on ourselves, let alone the whole globe, while we're incarnated in these bodies.
Yeah, and we look at the Christianity, so with Jesus himself, who is the divine, but then he's also struggling, and there is that kind of element, and there's doubt as well, and there's like where he contradicts himself too. So and to me that is kind of like quite interesting because then you would have the divine but within the body and experimenting the whole human potential and the human suffering and the confusion and the doubts, and to not be led astray by that. But I mean, you have an example who is, you know, that people follow it with Christianity, who is struggling as well. So the struggle is not a bad thing, and it's actually necessary, and it's probably constant even to the day we to our deathbed. It's a constant struggle.
And yes, and that's when I think about that, there's a part of me that gets kind of sad. You know, it's, oh,
Mm.
shouldn't we, what, can't we
Yeah,
perfect this realm?
yeah.
And at the end of the day, we don't know what the future holds. And
Mhm.
that's okay. But I come back to this idea of Shabbat, this idea of the celebration, and really getting into a headspace as a regular practice, and a heart space and a body space where we feel amazing, when we feel like it's all done. And that to me, there's a metaphor of, if someone was walking with a limp and they weren't able to walk straight, and they tried and they tried and they tried, eventually they probably just give up trying to do that. But what if one day a week they could walk perfectly straight and they could get a taste of what they're really working for. They'd never give up hope. And that's one of the essential teachings for me about that Shabbat mindset. Is it's supposed to feel like the world has been perfected, and we have been too. And whether or not we ever all get there, we get there for ourselves, but there's something beautiful. We get to experience enlightenment, so to speak, and the perfection of the world on a regular basis. That's just such a wonderful balm and addition and delightful dessert to our creative and work-filled lives.
And to go back to our regular lives too, because then that state, I don't think it'll be very interesting too. I find, okay, yes, you're enlightened, but what now? So what do I do with this, right? So for me, it's that, but I like it. I really like how you're saying, like, have that time where you connect with it and connect with yourself and the divine and your surroundings, but then go back and go through your regular life. So I was wondering what else in the Kabbalah specifically that you would like to share here with our audience of, like, in terms of how it's helping to get there and specific to the tradition of the Kabbalah.
Well, one of the central teachings has to do with work week consciousness, and it has to do with the hope of difficulty and difficult moments. There's a teaching that when things fracture within ourselves, or even when we're just experiencing difficulty, that we can break down, and that's okay. And that can be part of a transformative process. It's compared to the way that if you have a grape and then you crush it, it actually becomes grape juice. And if you leave it for long enough, it ferments and it becomes wine. And in Jewish culture and tradition, there are certain blessings that are said over certain foods. And there is a hierarchy based on how specific they are. And there's no more specific blessing. There's one that's equal to it, but the two most specific blessings, one of them is over wine and one of them is over bread. And both of those come out of a process of breaking something down and then fermenting it and transforming it. So that is how we can be as well. The hope is that if something comes our way that's really difficult, and we can go through that, and we can be conscious and get the supports that we need, but we don't have to return back to neutral at the end. That we can actually go from a -5, in that breaking, to a +5. That this is not something I tell people if they're coming to me and they're in crisis, because they don't need teachings in that moment. They need someone to listen to them and help them and feed them or whatever, that they need the support to go through the process. But if people are in a place where they're more on an even keel, this is the teaching. The teaching is that crisis and brokenness and difficulty, we can go down, but it's for the sake of ascending. It is the journey of Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White in the Lord of the Rings, that he battles the Balrog. He goes literally into the underworld and he levels up through that experience. And it's the transformational power of difficulty. And that is a very important teaching in Kabbalah. And there's several pages and teachings in the book that talk about that.
Love that. And it's the suffering that we have to go through life, but not to shun it, not to avoid it, but actually take advantage of it and turn it into something else. We have it with Maslow, who had a lot of suffering, and then he comes up with these beautiful ideas of transcending and becoming actualized. And Viktor Frankl, for me, the strongest example here of seeing the worst atrocities of humans, but coming up with such a beautiful philosophy and theory about life. And so to take that and not to complain or say, why me, or why is this happening, and so on, but instead of like turning that into gold, basically, the like alchemy.
Absolutely. And also, it's okay to return back to neutral or to be broken for a while. That not,
sure.
Sometimes people feel pressured around these teachings. No, it's about the hope, the potential. And so, but the goal really is to be present with our experience, find the supports that we need if we need them. I don't mean just outside supports. Sometimes it's inside supports, self-soothing and nourishment. Actually, distraction can be helpful sometimes, but being resourced, having good food and sleeping well. But we can go from a broken state and to really moving beyond and to grow through the process. And between
self-care,
if that's our orientation, and we're also sprinkling in moments of just joy and bliss and well-being, that's a pretty good formula for a holistic journey and a holistic spiritual life.
Yeah, and holistic is what my podcast is all about too. Of like taking all those elements, and self-care is an important part that people talk about that. And if it gives you pleasure, as long as it doesn't hurt other people and so on, that's fine, you know. And go have that cupcake that you long for, and so on. Break your diet occasionally, like that kind of just soothing yourself, as you're saying. But I'm also curious, what led you on this specific path? Because I know for me, it's like as a teen, I was always like, I read Russian literature, and I was like, I thought about death and like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and all so on, and so that really got me on a quest and led me to different paths, and also like sometimes you get lost in those, but then you find your way back and so on. But what was the driving force for you to get where you are at the to become an ordained rabbi as well?
Well, it started with just passion. When I was first exposed to Jewish spirituality when I was 16 years old, it was something woke up inside of me. And I had never felt that part of myself before. And it was just, I had a new love. All of the other things I was interested to that point paled in comparison. And I followed that passion in a frenzy, and I got so into it that I overwhelmed myself. I had one of these moments where I lifted too much weight in the spiritual gym, and I was injured. And it took me a little while to figure out what had happened and how to recover. And through that recovery, I learned about grounded spirituality through transpersonal psychology, in fact. And simultaneously, I was also studying a lot of religious history in university and really deconstructing my own religion. So by the end of that process, I was a universalist, and I went to this Buddhist-inspired university for a world religions master's. And when I was there, I had this call from beyond. It was this spiritual experience. I think I was finally ready to handle it. And it sort of threw me for a loop. I was trying to like move out of my tradition and into the world landscape. And there was something that said, no, you should do this in a Jewish way. And it took me 5 years basically to turn the corner and say, I'm going to give this a shot. I'm going to go to rabbinical school. And I didn't quite know why when I went there, but I just had to. I mean, it was more grounded than that. I had a wife and a child at this point, and we all decided together. But it was kind of an adventure. And after a few years in rabbinical school, and I could really learn how to decode the texts in their original language, I found this whole treasure trove of largely unknown, and some of it previously untranslated, grounded spirituality articulated through a Jewish mystical way. And I knew that I had to write this, and I had to work on it. And that was a big part of the journey, a combination of passion, messing up and hurting myself, learning how to be me in a fully grounded and integrated way. I mean, fully. I don't mean I've completed the work. I still struggle. Yeah, this is I teach groundedness partly because I need it too. And then following a combination of getting these calls and then learning how to navigate that in a way that's going to be tangible and real and possible, and then kind of turning that around, my seeking becoming teaching and wanting to share that with a broader audience.
That is wonderful. And I think we're driven often by perfection and becoming, you say, I'm a perfectionist and I want to reach perfection. But I think that's overrated. And I find that kind of bland, the perfection itself. It's really that journey, right? It's like once you get there, it's like, okay, well, what happens now, as we were saying? So really enjoy that journey, but also see the increases we're making, the connections we're making. That when I read a text now and I reread it years later and so on, that there's a different perspective on it. And it's like that never resonated in the way it does now than it did in the past, for example. And that aliveness of being alive and really choosing life over just rituals or empty like actions that we have, and really like fully embodying spirituality in our everyday moment to moment everyday life. I think that is hugely important.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's the journey is the path in that sense. The journey is the destination, I guess. And for me, I struggle with perfectionism as well. Like I know that the desire, but there's something. I keep coming back to Shabbat in this conversation, which is I think wonderful because I see it's such an important teaching right now. For in general, so many of us are overwrought and burned out, and there is a sense of I'm going to clean my house, I'm going to cook this food in advance, I'm going to get everything ready, and then when it starts, it's all good. Anything that hasn't been perfected in that for the preparation, it's fine, it's good. I'm just going to treat the world just like I'm going to treat myself. That's one of the teachings in Embodied Kabbalah. It's the idea that in that Shabbat mindset, the human, our individual self, we're whole. We've made it. Even if we have parts of us that need work, we're going to just do our best to celebrate all that we are. And in that sense, that we can have a moment or a day or 30 minutes or whatever of perfection and of goodness all around, just in that mindset, and try to live as though the world is complete. So I believe there's a way that we can find moments to include these impulses within us, even if most of the time we're let's give up on the idea of perfectionism. Let's just work on what we have, because the journey really is where so much of the beauty takes place.
And to start small and to start with yourself. And a lot of people are trying to change society, but they have to change themselves first. And so that then they will make a tremendous impact. And we are too focused on other things than ourselves often. And I think just be kind to yourself and you will be kind to others. I mean, that's the same thing, but you can't have just one or the other.
I agree. Yeah, I think it all comes down to balance. Yeah. That if someone is working on repairing the world, there's a term in Hebrew, tikkun olam, repairing the world or helping the world, healing the world, and they haven't done the inner work, let's say at all, they're probably going to be healing their projection of the world, or attempting, and they're going to be, it's a very difficult thing to actually do that kind of societal change work if we don't know who we are on a deep level. And similarly, some people spend so much time finding out who they are that they're not living in the world anymore.
That's true.
And so that both can happen. And ideally, we are living a combination of the inner path and the outer path, and finding that balance and harmony between them, because we really need both to be complete. And some people are going to be more the inner types, and some are going to be more the outer. And we're all different, but essentially, we need to be finding the ways that we can find that harmony and connection as who we are in this world today.
Yeah, and within the cosmos, and just like seeing us part of the whole. We're not isolated. We're not secluded from others. There's this connection, and we need that. As you say, connection, harmony. Those are very important words, I think.
And sometimes in order to get there, we need to be truthful and bold and cause temporary disagreements, and that's great too.
That's great too. That's necessary.
But I think like what Martin Luther King would say, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I believe that there are times when we really need to fight, so to speak. I hope it's more metaphysically maybe, or emotionally than physically. I'm really not promoting violence physically ever, but there are moments when things do break down, and that's part of a larger process. But I am of the opinion that our universe, our world is a wonderfully told and rich story that has moments of great crisis, and who knows, but we're heading overall towards something good. This is the nature of our world. It's the nature of humanity, even though it's not always apparent.
Exactly. Thank you so much for such an enlightening discussion and conversations. I want to remind everyone, Rabbi Matthew Ponak, your book is Embodied Kabbalah, Jewish Mysticism for All People. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your insights here on the Rash's World.
Thank you, Rash. It's been a delightful pleasure getting to know you.
Same here.